Hello there, this is Ashley Dawson. It is October 15th, 2021, and I'm here with Chris Saltmarsh, activist and writer who recently published this wonderful book, Burnt, Fighting for Climate Justice. So congratulations on your publication, Chris, and
Thanks very much.
Great to be with you. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, how you got involved in movement politics. You know, I'm really interested in what politicizes people. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your history.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I always kind of say that I joined the climate justice movement in my first week at university. I went to university in Sheffield in the UK. So as an 18-year-old, really in what we call Freshers Week here in the UK, I joined the People on Planet Society, which is, you know, an environmental and economic justice campaigning group, and they were running the fossil fuel divestment campaign in the UK at the time. And so I joined that, you know, the kind of the branch of the organization on my campus and got involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement. We'd kind of done pretty kind of, you know, classic liberal meat-free Mondays type environmental campaigning in like college in a couple of years before, but I do kind of count joining the divestment movement as my kind of entry into the climate justice movement. And so I got involved in that campaign, and you know, it was a pretty vibrant one on campus. By the end of the first year of my time in it, I was coordinating the campaign, and then halfway through my second year, we were lucky enough to win the campaign. And so kind of from there, I got involved in the People on Planet Network nationally. I started to get involved in kind of direct action stuff, for example, opposing coal mines in the UK, as well. You know, we went to, sorry, Ron.
Let me stop you for a second before you get too far into those other things. What was it that kind of hooked you about the divestment campaign and the campus activism? You know, do you think there was something in your past, or was it a particular mobilizing strategy that the campaign had? You know, what do you think was it that really got you involved and made you feel passionate about it?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. I think, you know, I'd always kind of had an interest in, you know, environmentalism, and I'd always kind of felt that it was, you know, an underrepresented kind of issue more broadly. And I think as well, you know, I'd always been kind of on the left, however far my politics were, you know, I was, I always kind of, you know, come at kind of climate stuff from a leftist perspective. And so I think what was really compelling about the divestment campaign was that it had a really explicit, you know, if not explicit anti-capitalist, certainly an anti-corporate critique, and like, you know, having that kind of antagonism with the fossil fuel industry and like, you know, the kind of corporations that were responsible for the climate crisis. I thought it was very, you know, it was very attractive to me. And then, you know, with it being on campus, you know, there's something about you know, running a campaign, I think, on a campus community where you can kind of make quite a big impact quite quickly, you know, compared to if you're maybe organizing in a city where there's hundreds of thousands of people. You know, there's a few thousand people on campus, and everyone kind of congregates in the same spaces. So it's quite, you know, it's quite a good space to really build a kind of consensus around something. And we felt like, you know, I think, yeah, we made quite a lot of progress, and we're able to really make our arguments to quite a large amount of people quite quickly. So I think that's certainly what kind of kept me involved.
Great, yeah, and it must have been really exciting to actually win a victory so quickly after.
Yeah, well, I think that was it. I don't know whether that's what hooked me, or I think that, you know, I have criticisms of the divestment movement and certainly how it's kind of you know, developed and built upon itself or not. But I think, yeah, what it has done very well is created a kind of you know, framework to win, you know, and there's a kind of whole generation, particularly of students who have an experience of winning a grassroots campaign, and I do think there's something quite important about that, you know, especially as climate activists. You know, we're kind of facing this big existential thing, you know, will we ever truly win? You know, who's to say? Possibly not within our lifetime. So having those kind of milestones, I think, is really important too.
Right. And then from what you were saying, it sounds like that campaign on campus became kind of launching pad for activism on a national scale. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And so, you know, I think a really formative experience for me is we went to COP21 in Paris. So that was during my second year of university, actually right after the university divested. And so we took a kind of group to Paris, and that was, you know, that was really exciting. You know, we were kind of doing actions in Paris alongside indigenous groups and other groups from kind of around Europe and around the world. And yeah, and I think from there I got involved in kind of the anti-fracking direct action movement in the UK. And then as well, kind of ended up working for People on Planet. So I was like coordinating the divestment campaign nationally. I was coordinating a kind of campaign to get banks to stop financing fossil fuels as well. And I've kind of worked for a couple of other kind of NGOs as well. And I think more recently, and again, always kind of been involved in the kind of the organized left or socialist kind of organizing at the same time. Really kind of thought to bring those two together through organizing in the Labour Party or the Labour movement as well.
Yeah, I've been to some of the counter summits at the COP meetings, and for me too, they were incredibly inspirational. There was an opportunity to not just be in solidarity with people from all over the world, but at least at the ones that I attended, there were very much sort of pedagogical events, right? So there are all of these different thematic meetings that took place around things like carbon trading, where activists would really do this kind of radical educational project, I think. Did you have that same kind of experience? And how did that transform your consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we went to a few events, and I think certainly that was, as you say, it was a kind of way of opening our world, and the kind of couple of dozen activists that I kind of went to this COP with in 2015, our kind of climate activism world had been our campus, and all of a sudden it opened it up to being a truly kind of global thing. I think in truth, most of the education that I think I received at that conference was actually almost in the streets, kind of doing actions and learning from them. And there was I think I certainly learned a lot from the very big mobilization that took place actually the day after COP finished. And on the one hand, that happened under quite a difficult situation of the state of emergency, and there were armed police on the streets, and for a long time we maybe didn't think that would happen. But at the same time, I think myself and a lot of others actually found it quite disempowering. It took place after the conference. It felt kind of weirdly like a celebration, even though this Paris Agreement that the whole movement had been criticizing had just been pushed through. And so I felt that kind of certainly triggered thoughts in my head about what is effective mobilization. But at the same time, we were taking action alongside the Indigenous Environmental Network and other kind of Indigenous groups who had broken off from that demo, and we kind of rallied to wake up really early on that morning and go and join a kind of I don't know if it was a vigil, but a kind of demonstration outside the Notre Dame Cathedral, and that I think that was again an incredibly powerful thing, and to be standing kind of side by side with comrades on the front lines from Indigenous movements again was I think it was really formative for our kind of understanding of climate justice. And actually when that gathering was broken up by the French police, again a kind of a really formative understanding of, well, how do imperial states relate to these people on the front lines of climate justice as well. So yeah, I think for those reasons it was massive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I wanted to ask you about your involvement with Labor for a Green New Deal. Keir Milburn, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, talks about sort of this generation of people who feel that there are political openings in the period after 2010 and sort of the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, and this whole series of conjunctions, which I think made folks, not just young people, but it was a sort of opening in time that allowed people to feel like there were political possibilities for transformation. And obviously that this wasn't even played out in different times and speeds in different parts of the world. The kind of the pink tide in Latin America, of course, was a really important precedent for these kinds of movements that were extra parliamentary, but then also hoping to make some kind of change within existing political channels. So could you tell me a little bit about how you got involved with Labor for a Green New Deal, and what your feeling was in relation to this kind of sense of the possibilities of working within established political channels?
Yeah, absolutely. So, at this time, we launched Labour for a Green New Deal kind of the first few months of 2019, so 2.5 years ago from now. And this was, we didn't know it at the time, but this was almost kind of the latter months of, Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. So we'd had, best part of 4 years of Jeremy Corbyn, a democratic socialist, leading a traditionally, centrist social democratic party, the Labour Party. And I, as I said before, I was someone who'd been on the left, but also kind of organising the climate movement. And there's not kind of, at that time in the UK, there wasn't many of us around, kind of, these people straddling both kind of the left and the environmental movement. But, there were certainly, through my kind of student organising and other bits of organising, that I knew a kind of solid few of us who had been involved in climate justice stuff, but while, were similarly engaged with and inspired by, Corbyn's leadership. And I think, one of the almost the critiques that we had of Jeremy's leadership of the party was that although, there was quite a promising and hopeful offer on a lot of stuff, actually the climate element of, the political offer wasn't as developed. There wasn't really a kind of grassroots member-led push to radicalize the climate policies of Corbyn's Labour. And so, there was a point at which I guess, the short of it being, we kind of decided, well, if it doesn't look like anyone else is going to set something like this up, so, we should. So essentially, like we looked to build an organization or a campaign that was a kind of critical friend of like Jeremy's leadership of the party. I think, we certainly saw the possibility of a socialist-led Labour Party being in power, in government like relatively soon. And obviously that didn't transpire, but, it certainly was something that was on the cards. And we wanted to make the most of that opportunity. And we thought it would be, a historical waste of an opportunity if that, government were to be elected and it not follow through on, our kind of principles of climate justice. And so, our analysis in some ways was that if you're the leader of the Labour Party, even if you're coming from the left, you're facing a number of kind of pressures. So you're facing pressures from within your own party, MPs who are going to be more right-wing than you. You're facing pressures from, trade unions. The Labour Party has a very deep and, traditional connection with labour unions in the UK, and they can be, more or less good on questions of climate change. I think they'll come on a journey, but maybe we'll come back to that. As well, as one of the major political parties, they have a relationship with business and capital, and that they will always be exerting pressure, and also the kind of NGO civil society, which again, is broadly progressive but not super radical. And so, the leadership would have been exerting all that or would have been experiencing pressure from all of those kind of ends, but not really from the membership. At this time, it was maybe 500,000 people who were members of the Labour Party, and the vast majority of them socialists. And so, what we understood was that there was a kind of latent desire for a kind of working class climate politics that understood the connection between economic injustice, exploitation of workers, and also climate injustice. And that rather than kind of pitting these two things against each other, there was a real space for a politics which brought them together and said that, look, we can tackle the kind of climate crisis while also building a kind of shared prosperity. And this was around the time that AOC in the US and the Sunrise Movement kind of brought the Green New Deal back into kind of mainstream consciousness. And for us, it was a case of kind of historical good timing where, for us, I think we have a slightly different interpretation of the Green New Deal to maybe how it is predominantly seen in the US. But, as a kind of broad thing, I think it captured that kind of class-based climate politics that we wanted to articulate through the Labour Party and through the Labour movement.
Let me stop you there. How would you contrast how ideas about a Green New Deal played out in Britain and in the US? I mean, obviously, the whole idea of the New Deal is anchored in US history and politics. But of course, given the constitution of the Labour Party and how different it is from the Democratic Party here in the US, things are going to be very dissimilar in many ways. So could you kind of highlight what you feel are some of the most important and decisive strategic differences in how you framed the idea of a Green New Deal for Labour from the way it's played out here in the US?
Absolutely. So I think, the core kind of element of it remained the same, and that, for us, we saw it as a mobilization really of the entire economy, stewarding investment towards the kind of dual aims of decarbonization and economic justice and, eliminating inequality. I think that some of the things that we really wanted to underline that maybe felt less emphasized certainly in the original kind of iteration of the Green New Deal, the kind of back end of 2018 or the beginning of 2019, was, I think, something around, pace of decarbonisation. So right from the beginning, we had an aim for a kind of zero carbon or a net zero target of 2030. And, we felt that the UK, within a kind of 10-year period should be like totally decarbonising. I think it was never quite that ambitious in the US. We also had, I guess, a point around, public ownership. We were really explicitly, socialists, like, coming into this. And I think there were certainly elements of, expanding the public sector in, like, the US Green New Deal. But I think for us, we had an analysis of expanding, public ownership of key, certainly key kind of more strategic sectors of the economy, things like energy and manufacturing made sense, but also really kind of making that argument to expand public ownership as widely across the economy as possible. Almost like a fundamental analysis that, as long as, the economy remains kind of dictated by the profit motive and in the hands of the private sector, that makes it more difficult to transition to a zero carbon economy, and certainly to do that fairly. And so, we took a fairly expansive view of that. And it's certainly one of our red lines, the public ownership of key industries, but also as a principle more broadly. And similar to that, we integrated a kind of politics of, like, universal basic services. So really, again, like, speaking to the element of the Green New Deal around meeting basic needs. So we really integrated that and talked about a national care service, as well as other elements. As well, but I think as well as saying, these services are about meeting basic needs and providing, things for at the point of use, is also, as I said, a way of expanding the public sector. And the bigger your public sector is, the more kind of leverage the government or the state has to steward or to coordinate this transition. So and the more kind of green jobs you can create as well. And then I think the final thing is was internationalism. And I think that always seemed to be a sense or a critique of the kind of first iteration of the Green New Deal, that it was essentially about stewarding investment within the borders of one country. And I think for us, we're internationalists as well as socialists. And we really felt that although the Green New Deal, maybe necessarily takes place primarily at the level of a nation state, it should be acting locally, but it should be acting globally as well. We should be talking about reparations and transferring finance internationally, debt cancellation, and that's always been a really central pillar. So I think, certainly you could say that a lot of those elements are also there in elements of, or in interpretations of the US Green New Deal. But I think for us, they were things we really put at the center, whereas maybe it wasn't so the case in other interpretations.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. And the way it's playing out at the moment in Congress, of course, the kind of energy transition plan that Biden actually has on the table is supposed to keep the transition in the hands of investor-owned utilities rather than building out the public sector, as you're saying. So, it really never gets at the question of control of the means of production, whether it's energy production or production more broadly. And it is also framed in terms of kind of inter-imperial capitalist competition rather than the kind of internationalism that you're talking about. So yeah, I think those are really important notes. Earlier, you'd mentioned the trade unions and their importance within labor. And here in the US, this is a huge issue. The trade union movement doesn't want to be split, but it has a kind of right wing, particularly in the sort of building trades, that is completely invested in fossil capitalism. We have a campaign here in New York City, New York State, to basically set up a public power entity, and we're finding that labor unions are very opposed to this. So I wonder how unions in Britain reacted to the idea of a Green New Deal and to this vision of kind of connection between transformation of employment broadly and of the kind of environmental structure of the nation.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting to compare, our respective labor movements. And I think for us, one of the key strategic differences, that kind of benefits our situation is that, whereas the Democratic Party in the US is a corporate kind of party, we're lucky enough to have, for all of its flaws, and it has many, many flaws, we do have a Labour Party. We do have a party that has those kind of historic links to trade unions and is the parliamentary representation of the Labour movement. And I think what that's allowed us to do is almost use the Labour Party as a vehicle through which to bring together the kind of climate movement and the Labour movement. And I think, what we saw was that when we were initially kind of bringing our ideas forward, there was some really strong support from perhaps the more radical elements of the Labour movement here in the UK. And so one example would be the Fire Brigades Union, which isn't a huge union. It has incredibly high density within the workplaces it represents, fire brigades, but obviously only represents fire brigades. It's like a relatively small portion of the workforce. But, Matt Rack, who is the General Secretary, makes this point that for their industry, climate change is an industrial issue already today, because firefighters are on the front line of dealing with the climate crisis, wildfires, extreme weather, flooding, perhaps most pronounced in the US, where extreme or wildfires are perhaps more of an issue, but certainly here in the UK as well. And there's an issue in the UK around fire brigades not receiving funding actually to deal with things like flooding or climate-related events. But so the Fire Brigades Union, for that reason, were very strongly in favour. The Communication Workers Union is a particularly radical union. The Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union, another particularly radical union. They were quite clearly and solidly supporting our agenda quite early on. Then you kind of have the bigger energy unions, so Unite the Union, GMB, and Unison kind of represent most energy workers, certainly among the affiliated unions to the Labour Party. And again, within those unions, there was a difference of approach to us. And I think, before I kind of break that down a bit more, I guess it's worth saying, our analysis is very much one of the Labour movement being, almost in a moment of kind of historic defeat. We've had 4 decades of neoliberalism, which has been a very deliberate project to disempower the working class, to smash unions, to introduce more restrictive anti-trade union laws, and to reorient power towards capital. So this is the context that these unions are operating within, and actually in many ways their enduring survival is a victory and something to be celebrated. But what comes with that is maybe a political conservatism, and certainly a strategic conservatism as well, where often the orientation is around protecting or creating new jobs, or paying conditions in those jobs, with a very limited kind of attempt to shape industrial strategy more widely. So I think in some ways that's kind of the limit that we came up against with some of those bigger general unions or energy unions. For example, GMB represents oil and gas workers. Heathrow Airport is one of the most densely unionized workplaces in the UK, and to be honest, probably the world. And GMB and Unite both represent workers in that. And so these are quite, these are tensions that exist. But I think one of the things that's worth saying is, when we kind of tabled our Green New Deal in 2019, every affiliated union did vote for a version of the Green New Deal at Labour Conference 2019. And so I think actually what we saw is being able to articulate a climate politics that had a very explicit, tie to the politics and the values and the principles of the Labour movement. To articulate a kind of class-based climate politics was a really important step in almost bringing unions kind of along with us. And I think there's a real deep distrust between the Labour movement in the UK and environmentalists, and it sounds similar in the US. And for me, I think there's a lot of frustration in the environmental movement towards how unions behave, for example, around things like airport expansion. Whereas for me, I think the environmental movement has done quite a poor job of building solidarity and really being sympathetic to where our comrades in the Labour movement are coming from. So I think that's kind of what we tried to do. And I think even in the kind of couple of years since 2019, when the motion was first tabled, I think we've seen Unite the Union become much more confident, and Unite is always a relatively left-wing union anyway, but become much more confident in supporting the agenda. I think Unison supported it relatively uncontroversially this time, and GMB is maybe provides more of a sticking point. They have they didn't vote for the kind of 2030 element of the motion in 2019, and their argument was one very much of we don't want to be dictated by timelines when there's not really a record of kind of energy transition happening in this country in a way that serves workers. And I think there's a philosophical difference whereas we would be quite happy to kind of almost tear down the fossil fuel industry and invest in a new green energy industry. Their approach is, GMB is a gas union. The general secretary used to be a gas worker. Their approach is very much, well, let's decarbonize the industry we already have, rather than having this quite risky transition. So it's, there's philosophical differences there that you can understand and kind of put a pin in almost. And I think, what we are doing is working to, almost building up a sense of confidence and trust around where we do agree. And I think the Labour Party is a vehicle for that. And I'm really kind of happy with how it's going. Obviously, it can always go quicker. But I guess just my final word on kind of the union's question would be, certainly from an organizing perspective, if you are someone who's interested in being a climate activist, but you're a bit of a loose end of how to do that, I think the thing I've been telling people increasingly is join a trade union. But don't just, the kind of, I don't know about in the US, but the left in the UK has this kind of common refrain of join a union every time anything goes wrong at a workplace. And it's like, well, yeah, do join a union, but also recognize their flaws, agitate, organize your workplace, and then agitate for them to be more politically radical and industrially militant. Because I think we need a politically radical and an industrially militant trade union movement to almost lead the Green New Deal. And I think for me, if efforts for a Green New Deal aren't led by the Labour movement, then they're on very, very shaky ground. And that's a difficult conversation to have because of where the Labour movement is politically and strategically. But I do think it's an imperative that as organisers we make interventions in that space. So that would certainly be my call to action if you'd like to anyone watching.
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. And I really appreciate your sort of situating of these questions within the bigger historical context of years of conservative counter-revolution, essentially. So the unions are really with their back to the wall, but the only way to get out of that is to adopt a more militant stance. Okay, so as you mentioned, Corbyn's effort was defeated, and there's now a Tory government in place in Britain. I'd like to bring us up to the present moment. In the 2 years or so since the work you did with Labour for a Green New Deal, there's been a kind of quite mixed picture. There's XR launched and had a huge impact in terms of direct action across the UK for all of its flaws. And then, of course, there's been the pandemic and the lockdown. So, on the one hand, there's been kind of massive mobilization in Britain on a level that we really haven't seen in the US, certainly not in cities, although the US has had a lot of very activist blockadia politics in more rural areas, including right now around Line 3, the tar sands pipeline. But then a lot of that was sort of crimped by the pandemic, and now we're looking at the build-up to the COP in Glasgow in Scotland. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you have been involved in working to mobilize people coming out of the pandemic, and what you think some of the kind of key strategies for the movement going forward might be.
Yeah, definitely. I guess the first thing I'd say is yes. So I think you're right to point to XR, and I think at the same time in the UK the youth strikes kind of happened at the same time. So I think it's interesting. You had the Green New Deal happening politically, and XR and youth strikes on the streets kind of all at the same time. And my kind of view was that they were responding to the same moment. There was this kind of bit of the summer and autumn of 2018 where you had real extreme weather around the world. You had a couple of I think there was an IPCC report, one that was there's 12 years left to save the world, and then there was the Hot House Earth report, and I think those kind of things coalesced and really almost kind of gave a bit of a kickstart to climate consciousness. And I think those three elements kind of were responsible for that happening at the same time. That was interesting. And I think you're certainly right to say that there are elements of XR that there have been criticisms around. I think I was probably one of the first people on the left in the UK to criticize them publicly. But I think what they certainly did demonstrate was that there's a real latent desire within a big chunk of certainly the British population to have quite a radical and rapid solution to the climate crisis. And in some ways what made XR successful in the way that it did was, and it's a contradiction because it's also one of the primary criticisms I have, but it was that kind of beyond politics approach. So they didn't take a very ideological line. They didn't really have any policy. They had three quite vague demands. But what that kind of allowed them to do was mobilize this quite broad base of people, mobilize a lot of pensioners, a lot of reasonably middle-class people. And, you know, it's one of those where as soon as you start taking positions on things, you know, in some ways you're kind of limiting off the people you can mobilize, because the more people there might be that disagree with you. But I think, you know, what they did demonstrate is that, yeah, there's a lot of like desire to take actually quite bold action, you know, really put yourself in harm's way for this quite broad view of, yes, we need to do something about the climate emergency. At the same time, I think one of the exciting things about the youth strikes was they, in some ways, they began to, not entirely, but begin to, you know, resolve one of the big issues I think the climate movement has, which is like, what's your base? What's the constituency that you're seeking to organize? Because I think too often the climate movement, certainly in the UK, relies on this kind of quite small milieu of like urban left liberals who kind of almost have the privilege to care about the climate crisis. And it means that, you know, you have the same people turning out to all the demos and stuff. But, you know, what the youth strikes did was say, well, our constituency is like basically all children. And, you know, we're going to mobilize around this one action, which is like striking from school. So, you know, they have that kind of shared, you know, thing they can do. And they did it really effectively. And I think there's a lesson there for others in the climate movement of saying, you know, don't kind of necessarily try to like mobilize literally everyone. Identify like what is a base or a constituency that can be mobilized or organized around this issue, or like a specific call to action or whatever, and kind of go with that. And I think, again, if people are at a loose end, like I would kind of encourage them to think like, well, what community or what base of people are you connected to, and how could they maybe be like creatively mobilized? And I think, you know, on the pandemic, like I think the pandemic was really tough because you had these kind of dual like insurgency of XR and the youth strikes, and it really like killed them, you know, overnight. They stopped mobilizing, and I think they were probably tailing off a little bit, but it like really killed them. And it was, you know, who's to say like where both of those movements would be now if that hadn't have happened. But I think, you know, one of the things I write about in the book Burned is I think there's also a lesson in that. And, you know, for me, what happened during the pandemic, we stopped doing basically everything that was like normal to us. You know, every day-to-day activities, going to work, meeting your friends, they all stopped, but so did climate demos. And I think for me, that almost tells you a lesson of like, well, you know, the kind of climate demos we were doing here in the UK, you know, standing outside a bank that finances fossil fuels, you know, turning upside an insurance company, doing a youth strike, you know, doing an XR blockade, they kind of became ritual. And I think almost to a degree that they were, I think, probably losing their potency. And so, but what we did see in the UK was a resurgence in, and I think obviously globally, a resurgence in Black Lives Matter mobilizations right in the middle of the pandemic. And actually, I think the first time I was among like lots of people really in the middle of the pandemic was at a Roads Must Fall demonstration in Oxford, where I used to live. And so there was a power to that like despite the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement was able to mobilize. And I think it was almost the inverse of the climate movement, whereas like there'd been a lot of kind of ground work done by BLM kind of, you know, in a kind of off period almost. It was able to explode then when the time was right. Whereas I think, you know, my kind of feeling with the climate movement is that rather than kind of seeking to constantly be doing actions, you know, it's a very action-oriented movement, I think, actually taking the time to organize through institutions, so organizing through the labor movement, organizing in communities, organizing through political parties. And then when we need to mobilize en masse, you know, we should certainly do that. But it shouldn't necessarily be our default form of action. And so to kind of get around to answering your question about, you know, what are we doing kind of out of the pandemic? I mean, for me, you know, I don't want to be like too prescriptive, but like, you know, the kind of prescriptions that I kind of do lean towards in the book are to kind of make this argument that, you know, as a climate movement, we need to be oriented towards essentially the goal of like capturing state power. And I think the kind of level of transformations that we're looking for probably aren't going to be afforded to us by like lobbying or seeking to leverage like a capitalist government. Like, you know, whatever the approach is, like, I think that does need to be our ambition. And that comes with a recognition that that is a really hard thing to do, and like probably isn't going to happen within the time frame that like we would quite like. So I think that also needs to be some like thinking about like, well, how do we deal with that too? But, you know, I think, yeah, that needs to be like our kind of headline strategic aim needs to be like, we need to capture state power and deliver a Green New Deal, almost like ourselves. I think the experience of Corbynism, probably the experience of Bernie Sanders, similar kind of democratic socialist movements in Europe tell us that seeking to do that purely through an electoral strategy of like capturing a party and like winning an election with it isn't quite good enough. You know, the powers against us are going to be almost too strong. So that electoral strategy needs to be buttressed by, I think, as I was saying, a politically radical and industrially militant labor movement that can, you know, begin to make interventions in the economy even out of power, create the conditions to put that kind of movement in power, but also more importantly, like if we were to win an election as the left, defend it from the kind of forces of reaction, but also push it further. Those kind of dual aims. And then I guess the other flank of like a buttressing of that strategy would be a kind of radical social movement. So I think a set of social movements, whether it's mobilizing in the streets, whether it's taking direct action, whether it's organizing communities, that has a kind of clear and relatively unified radical climate justice politics of the kind of Green New Deal I was describing, is prepared to take quite bold action when necessary. But again, and you know, I think for me, that's a great thing to do if you're not interested in electoral politics or you're not interested in labor movement politics. Like, yeah, there's still lots to do, but I do think people should still have their eyes on this kind of shared goal of capturing state power. And so I think, you know, that's what I'm kind of trying to push people towards. And, you know, when we built Labour for a Green New Deal, we built it to be an enduring organisation that kind of outlasted Corbyn's leadership or any of our individual involvement. So we're kind of trying to deepen our work within the party, but also within the Labour movement as well. And I think, yeah, you know, ahead of COP, obviously COP is in Glasgow in the UK. Been kind of, yeah, chatting with people this week. And I think, you know, there is for me a worry that like the climate movement has this tendency to like sink a lot of resources into COP. And then it like inevitably fails on its own terms. And then everyone's like, oh, what do we do now? So, you know, I'm really hoping that we can use this COP in, you know, a couple of weeks' time as a platform from which to carry on, to build coalitions, strengthen the links between the Labour movement and the climate movement. And actually, I think the last thing I'll say just on this is I think one of the most exciting possibilities for doing that is GMB, the trade union I mentioned before, seems to be quite successfully balloting workers to take strike action. At the moment, it's kind of, I think, yeah, cleansing workers like on trains or in depots. So there's, you know, the potential that they will quite significantly disrupt a lot of travel infrastructure around COP in Glasgow during the conference. And I think if a climate movement, if those strikes go ahead and a climate movement doesn't show just like utmost unconditional solidarity with them, then I think, I mean, obviously it will be morally bad, but also a massive missed opportunity to like build those links and build that solidarity. Because yeah, if we don't have a climate movement and a labor movement that's totally united in both in politics and strategy, then I think we probably don't really stand a chance.
Thank you so much for your analysis, Chris. Really interesting and hugely ambitious. So I'm sure you're extremely busy. I should let you get to it. You know, we all are, of course. I want to just finish by telling whoever might be watching this that they should definitely read Chris's book, Burnt, Fighting for Climate Justice. As his comments today have shown, there's a huge amount of fascinating analysis and historical perspective that Chris speaks from. So Chris, thanks so much. Really good chatting with you. And I will end the recording right now.